Good evening. My name is Stephen Offelt, and it is my pleasure as the director of the McDevitt Center for Creativity and Innovation here at Moyne College to welcome you to this evening's presentation by the eminent Jesuit theologian and scholar, Father Roger Haight. We are fortunate to have him here. We are honored to have him here, and we are also fortunate to have him here. He arrives fresh from the airport, having endured 2 canceled flights, 1 canceled train, and at least 2 flight delays. Clearly, it was meant to be. Father Haight holds a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in philosophy from St. Beckman's College in Cebu City in the Philippines, which closed 2 years after his graduation, unrelated, I'm sure. A bachelor's in sacred theology from Woodstock College in Maryland, a master's and a doctorate in theology from the University of Chicago, and a licentiate in sacred theology from the Jesuit School of Theology in Chicago. Father Haight is past president of the Catholic Theological Society of America and has taught at Jesuit, Protestant, and secular institutions across the globe in, for example, Chicago, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Toronto, Manila, Lima, Nairobi, Paris, and now an exotic locale, New York City, where he is currently scholar in residence at Union Theological Seminary. While teaching across the globe, he's been quite prolific, authoring, by my count, more than 10 books, including, I'll read you a few titles, Experience and Language of Grace, The Future of Christology, Dynamics of Theology, Alternative Visions and Interpretation of Liberation Theology, Jesus, Symbol of God, which was awarded the top prize in theology from the U.S. Catholic Press Association, and his most recent book, published in 2012, Christian Spirituality for Seekers, Reflections on the Spiritual Exercises of Ignatius Loyola. It is the topic of that book, which he will be speaking with us about this evening. We have copies of the book available for sale outside in the lobby. Father Haight has graciously agreed to sign copies of the book if you would like him to. And following the talk and question and answer period, we will also invite you to join us in the lobby for refreshments, sweets, coffee, decaf, tea, and so on. Please join me in welcoming Father Haight.
Good. I'm so very pleased to be here. Long trip, but well worth it. Thank you for having me here. I'll speak for about 45 minutes. Basically, you can follow the program there as I lay out this project that I've finished on spirituality. I'm not a spirituality person by trade. You know, people do this for a living. I'm more a systematic theologian, but I was, as I tell a brief narrative here, how I got interested in this project. So during my second year at Union Theological Seminary in New York, I was asked to participate in a resource team that attended to the spiritual formation of the community, especially the students. As part of that program, I offered the spiritual exercises of Ignatius Loyola to 35 students over a period of 8 weeks in the spring of 2007. And 2 years later to another group of 25, and 2 years later, and so on. I've been doing it yearly, and I will do it next semester again. Now, Union Theological Seminary in New York is a very distinctive place. I would describe it as a liberal, Protestant, interdenominational seminary that has a strong ethos of social engagement, but is centrist in its doctrinal and theological issues. Its student body is very pluralistic, with people from all denominations. It includes Unitarians who do not define themselves as Christian, others who have no church affiliation, people who belong to other religions, among those who belong to all the denominations that we know. So this describes broadly the people who engaged the spiritual exercises as I gave them and appreciated them. Having learned from that experience, I have completed a project of interpreting the spiritual exercises for a very broad audience, not excluding Catholics, of course, but more pointedly addressed to Protestants and people outside Christianity, perhaps members of other religions, perhaps with no religious affiliation at all, but who are looking for spiritual depth. That's the key. In this presentation, then, I want to give you an overview of what I have done in this work. I will not presuppose a knowledge of Ignatius's spiritual exercises, but rather simply lay out what I mean by spirituality first, and then what I mean by seekers. And then I'll introduce Ignatius Loyola, the exercises, very briefly and very broadly, not being particularly attentive to detail. And then I'll try to show that this approach to the exercises can speak to our times. There's a larger project involved in this than just the immediate audience. So first, what is spirituality? Let me begin by briefly defining how I use this term, because no two people alike use it in the same way. So what is the basic answer to this question on which there is very little agreement? People use it in so many different ways that it becomes very, very important to attend to what I am referring to when I use the term. I understand spirituality primarily to the way people lead their lives, with special reference to an ultimate horizon which guides their behavior. So spirituality is not restricted to the religious sphere, but it includes a person's whole life. In this view of things, everyone has a spirituality. This conception rescues spirituality from some esoteric sphere while without tying it exclusively to specifically religious behavior. It's bigger than that. But spirituality may or may not be religious. It consists much more than simply the conscious or unconscious flow of activity. It's not just behavior that's unintentional or not explicitly guided by principles. It includes that set of ultimate values that constitute an horizon that contains the signals by which one measures importance and by which one makes decisions because things are more important or less important. Spirituality then refers to life lived in the face of ultimate reality. The way one leads one's whole life ultimately defines one's spiritual identity. The most secular of seekers has a spirituality, albeit sometimes unstable and sometimes by definition, looking for more formation, more crystallization in their own consciousness. What is Christian spirituality? Christian spirituality, in distinction of all others, is the way a group or an individual persons lead their lives before God, as God is revealed to us or to them in Jesus Christ. There are other ways of looking at Christian spirituality. Many authors restrict the term to explicitly religious practices of a certain kind, Christian devotions, essentially, Sunday worship, practicing various methods of prayer, and so on. That constitutes one's spirituality, a very narrow definition. This way of defining spirituality has some advantages. In other words, it's very clear and definite. It restricts the field of what pertains to spirituality to specifically religious activity. That's my spirituality. That's over there. And then this is the rest of my life. So you know exactly what you're referring to. But in so doing, it tends to isolate spirituality, compartmentalizes it, so to speak, from other aspects of life. It is one's whole life, it seems to me, that ultimately defines one's relationship to God. And therefore, one's whole life is integral to one's spirituality and really defines who one is in standing before God. So thinking of Christian spirituality as including the whole of life, as that is measured by our relationship with God as revealed by Jesus, essentially conforms to the idea that Christian spirituality consists in following Christ. Now, the idea of following Christ is not a usual way that most Christians think of their spirituality. I mean, as a Jesuit, that's what I think, and as religious, that's what I think. But ordinary people don't think of themselves as followers of Jesus Christ. In fact, they tend to leave that for religious people and clergy and so on. Maybe they do. I'm not trying to make an argument to that effect. But it seems to me, in a moment's reflection, things begin to fall in place when you conceive of Christian spirituality as being a following of Jesus Christ. What are Christians if they are not followers of Jesus Christ? It is a near perfect, simple definition of Christianity itself. The first broad meaning of following, therefore, is equivalent to being in some measure in conformity with the one who constitutes or defines Christian faith, following Jesus Christ. The third, to sort of set the pattern here, the spiritual exercises of Ignatius Loyola. So I don't want to presuppose that all are familiar with the spiritual exercises, even though this is a Jesuit university, or even who Ignatius of Loyola was, and so I want to introduce them briefly. People who are already familiar with the exercises may find interesting how putting them in the context of being offered to seekers affects a primitive or basic description of them. First, Ignatius was a Spaniard, a Basque, born around 1491, really not exactly sure, 25 years before the beginning of the Reformation. He was sent to the residence of a person in the Spanish royalty at age 15, and up to age 30, he served people in high places. In 1521, he was an assistant to the viceroy, in effect the governor of Navarre. In that year, he was wounded in a battle with French forces over the city of Pamplona in northern Spain. He was brought back home in Aspasia on a stretcher, and during his convalescence, he went through an extended conversion experience that completely changed him into a unique combination of pilgrim, mystic, student at Paris, activist, and founder of the Jesuits, finally, in 1540. Now, the essence of Ignatius's conversion is well known, and it's very important. It took the form of replacing his loyalty to his king, and in his last 3 years before his conversion, his viceroy, with an absolute devotion and loyalty to Jesus Christ. Just transferred them, so to speak. And used the same kind of language in his devotion to Christ that he used when he was in service of the crown. It's a shift. In this shift, he also transferred his imagination, all his energy, and his activism from one leader, the king, or the king's representative, the king's cause, to the person and the cause of Jesus of Nazareth. During the intense year and a half of his conversion experience, he read, consulted people, kept notes, wrote down considerations that preserved the spiritual experiences that he had so that he could share them with other people. These developed over years into a manual of prayer and meditation in a program that is meant to lead a person, as it did him, to a reform of his or her life, or to make a basic life decision in complete freedom, standing before God, without any other attractions that cramped his freedom. The spiritual exercises, then, as a title, are thus a book, but one that is unreadable, in effect, because it's really a manual of instructions, practices, a how-to book of how to implement this program of meditations on the stories of Jesus' life. But here's the important part. The substance of these exercises consists of structured contemplations or considerations of the scenes of Jesus' ministry that Ignatius found in the Gospels. These are surrounded by 9 or 10 considerations that give them a specific flavor that is Ignatian, of Ignatius, and make them a very distinctive approach to Jesus of Nazareth. But all the instructions together then give the exercises a kind of special language that has tended to make these spiritual exercises take on a life of their own and to codify a spirituality that's very, very distinctive. It's distinctive in Jesuit life because all Jesuits are raised on it, and it supplies a language with which they speak with each other. But in so doing, it sort of detracts or minimizes the very substance of these exercises as simply considerations of the life of Jesus as that is found in the 4 Gospels. In other words, the exercises in their core are spiritual reading of the Gospels and consideration of the Gospel stories. They are evangelical. In the root sense of that term, a literal and root sense, they are considerations of the life of Jesus strung out for an intended purpose. So much for Christian spirituality. Now let me turn to seekers, I'm a speaker, seekers. What is a seeker, and who are they? The term seeker is very, very broad and inclusive. I'm not exactly sure what a seeker is. You kind of know a seeker, or you know yourself if you're a seeker. But I don't want to leave it at that to refer to just everybody. In other words, you have to sort of try to put some specific meaning around this category. So let me try. By seekers, I mean those who do not feel settled in any definite faith commitment. They live on the edge, especially on the edge of any creed, and they do not fully endorse any religion. They may endorse a religion, but not fully. They have no lock on reality, and certainly no master narrative that either excludes all others or includes all others without remainder. But they want more coherence in their vision of things and more direction in their lives, and they are looking for a more comprehensive meaning in life, in their lives, but in life generally. What about comprehensive meaning? Comprehensive suggests width and depth, like a horizon within which discrete elements can be measured by seeing them in a larger perspective which allows you to relate them to each other. Certainly some things in relationship to other things are more important. In order to compare and measure things, one has to be able to see them in this wider field of vision so that they can be related to each other and measured against each other. The reference for the term seeker, therefore, operates within the big picture. We're talking here about not little questions, but the big questions of meaning and purpose in existence itself. Seekers live their lives with these questions. They are not content with the answers that have been proffered them. And they are looking for symbols that can give some vision to their lives and some order to the succession of events that make it up. Is it good to be a seeker? The description given can be construed as something positive in contrast to those who know everything. Persons with all the answers, insufferable types. What is the valuation implied by the category seeker? Things begin to get tricky at this point. Is it good to be an agnostic? Much depends on the context and the premises of the question. For the religious faithful, agnosticism can spell something like a loss of faith. But in a secular context, it simply confesses ignorance. I don't know. So too with the notion of seeker. It admits shades of meaning even within a religious context. A soft religious meaning of being a seeker could refer to the religious desire that is tested by the dark glasses through which we see transcendent things in this life. This lack of clarity makes seeking part of every critical person's life, it seems to me, in some sense, a soft sense. A sharper meaning of being a seeker may refer to a constant and troublesome nagging, like a deep need of the hungry person for food. This nagging that could border on a temptation to despair if it was a serious thing. Or it may be both together. What has to be preserved with the term seeker across the many nuances that it can take is in a latent impatience and lack of satisfaction with what one has been provided, and a proportionately equal desire for more coherence in life. That's what makes a seeker, it seems to me. And it can be of various grades and depths and seriousness. Another question has to do with the depth and prevalence of the uprootedness associated with being a seeker. I have to defer to sociologists, and sociologists specifically of religion, to answer this question across the different segments of Western society. But I can say this, that this effort to address the seeker as well as those who self-identify as Christian has been stimulated by, for me, an undocumented premise that this condition of being a seeker is deep and widespread. It's latent in the cliché that I am spiritual but not religious. That's what's going on there. Moreover, given the growing lack of interest in traditional religions in the West, becoming a seeker is rapidly becoming the statistically normative condition of ordinary believers. Certainly in Europe, more and more in the United States, if they are not downright apathetic. One way to approach this situation, a way that is not polemical but purely constructive, consists in addressing the generic seeker. Those who are either thoroughly secular or schooled in some religious faith, but they're seekers. But they are not, they share this in common, moved by the systems as they stand, and they are looking for deeper depth of meaning in some language that makes sense to their lives as it's being lived, as it's being encountered in the present day. How does Christianity respond to the basic questions that lie at the foundation of spirituality? Depth in living. Is human existence meaningful? And from whence does this meaning come? Ignatius's spiritual exercises addresses these questions on an existential and practical level. For the seeker, not much more than that, it seems to me, is demanded. In other words, the exercises have a key that can fit in this lock, it seems to me. Can the exercises be offered to seekers? Can the exercises be offered to seekers at one end of the spectrum, those with no religious belonging? I say yes, because I have done it to some with spiritual benefit among those who made them. So this seems to be not this seems to be more than just another example of an accepted principle that the spiritual exercises have to be adapted to all audiences. In other words, if people don't have religious faith, there's a legitimate question here of whether or not these exercises can be adapted and adjusted to people without a deep religious commitment. I mean, the question is deep. In other words, if you do give them to such people, are they really the exercises of St. Ignatius, or have you turned them into something else? That's the question. My view is that the spiritual exercises can be addressed to one without religious faith in principle, because the way that Ignatius set them up has the answer to that question. The substance of the exercises consists in imaginatively entering into the gospel stories of Jesus of Nazareth. But Jesus was a human being, and because he has been, quote, written up in the Gospels, he is a public figure. Therefore, all people can approach him with understanding. In other words, Jesus forbids no one from approaching him. He's accessible in the gospel stories to all. Now, there's no doubt that Ignatius had a high Christology. He can address Jesus as his divine majesty. But he insists in presenting the gospel stories in a way that actually highlights Jesus as being a human being and thus able to be followed. His programmatic meditation on Jesus presents him as a leader who is comparable to an earthly king. This humanity of Jesus is the key to his communicability and his universal relevance. Everyone can approach him. Everyone can appreciate Jesus insofar he is a human being and thus like them. Ignatius is quite explicit that Jesus is a leader who, in leading, will suffer no less than what his followers will encounter. At the same time, one should notice that a consistent appeal to Jesus' human life and ministry creates some tensions with a Christian sensibility that Christian doctrine proclaims about this person and his relationship with God. This tension lies on the surface. This tension lies beneath the surface of the language that I employ in reflecting on Ignatius's meditations. And for some, this tension can be quite acute. The problem consists in finding a language that accommodates two quite different audiences. Those used to thinking of Jesus as divine, and those approaching him as a fellow human traveler. This is not a theological problem. It's not a theological problem. We should be clear about that, because the doctrine of Chalcedon, the classical Christian doctrine of Jesus' divinity and humanity, precisely preserves the integrity of Jesus as being a human being just exactly like us. The problem is rhetorical and intrinsic to finding the right language of how to address this Jesus language to seekers. It can only be resolved with patience from each side of the issue, it seems to me, tolerance on the part of Christians who expect to hear more about Jesus' divinity than I offer in these reflections, and tolerance on the part of the secular seekers who may already hear too much of it. So there's a real tension here, and it will be a bone of contention, it seems to me, among readers of what I've proposed. The resolution of this tension, it seems to me, however, is simple, but important. Attaching oneself to Jesus as a human leader does not fully constitute the Christian spirituality and belief. It's only a first stage of being a Christian. Once this is recognized, that this approach to seekers is not meant to be a full-blown theology, but precisely an approach to seekers on their level, whatever level they come to these spiritual exercises, the problem is almost automatically solved. It dissolves, in effect. How Jesus appeals to seekers today. How will seekers respond to Jesus as presented through the lens of these exercises as I put them forward for precisely this audience? Obviously, there's no one way, or even I'm going to give it three types, but I mean there are many ways, as many ways as there are people who approach Jesus. There will be that many ways. But I want to give three broad types to show you that there are different ways in which people can respond to spiritual exercises being offered to speakers. The first is as a learner to a teacher. So I would call it the relationship precisely of the learner to the teacher. One is looking for something, seeking in order to learn, and one approaches Jesus as a teacher. He was, in fact, a teacher. At the outset, and perhaps during the whole process, one has a relationship to Jesus that remains that of a learner. Jesus is a moral and a spiritual teacher. One learns new and distinctive insights into the spiritual life from him. I don't want to characterize this relationship as shallow. It can be very profound and deep and life-changing. It could stimulate a revolutionary change in a person's life. This would be the first relationship with Jesus that a seeker might enter into. Secondly, as a client. A client relationship includes the first but goes much further. Here a person becomes, in some measure, dependent on Jesus. Jesus was more than a teacher, he was also a healer. And his healing can be construed on many different levels, physical and psychological, spiritual. He was an exorcist or a faith healer. But he was also a deep spiritual leader who mediates a spiritual wholeness that becomes, in the final analysis, what Christians mean by salvation. Salvation can take many forms and be conceived in many different ways. The New Testament has many, many different metaphors and analogies for what Jesus did as Savior. But the idea is that Jesus mediates a connection between a person and ultimate reality, God, so that he becomes part of the Jesus becomes part of the salvation itself as its communicator. Here you have a deeper existential relationship of Jesus to the client. However, that client is a client in many, many different ways. Thirdly, as an apprentice. A third relationship is quite distinct from the first two. In certain ways, it includes them. It's the relationship of an apprentice, the one to one whose way of life one is going to embrace and to practice. So this relationship is one of learning. It's also, to a certain extent, being a client, but it goes much further. Here, one is not merely dependent, which suggests passivity, but also a collaborator, a conspirator, a companion. One accompanies and walks at the side of Jesus in order to take part in the action that he was performing and to participate in it, promote it. The passivity and appropriation of the influence of Jesus becomes transformed into a taking up of the same project that he was consumed by. This third response describes fairly accurately what Ignatius proposes in the imaginary terms of the comparison of Jesus to an earthly king with a noble cause that one with integrity could not possibly refuse to join. But each person has to find his or her particular response. Adjusting the spiritual exercises to the 21st century seeker. Before concluding, I want to indicate another adjustment that I've made in order to adapt the spiritual exercises to the 21st century. The exercises are divided into 4 weeks, as you know, or as some know, that represent the duration of a month. In their extended form, they would last for a month. The first week functions as a kind of introduction to the last 3 that consider the story of Jesus and end with the resurrection stories and the appearance stories from the Gospels. I found that the first week needs to become much more of an extended introduction for people who are making the exercises. So I stretch out the exercises to introduce people to religious language, to creation, to a kind of fundamental anthropology, to see the ball game in which these reflections are transpiring. And then on the other end, finishing the exercises with Jesus' resurrection for our age today is too abrupt. The Christian story really begins with the resurrection and takes off in a community of followers that through the first century gradually evolved from a sect, a Jewish sect, into a church. And so it's important to connect through especially Luke's Acts of the Apostles, that development of Christians into a group called the church. It makes a link between ourselves and Jesus through the community if you're a member of that community. If I had more time, I'd describe some of the adaptations of particular meditations that are required in offering the exercises to seekers, but I can offer one brief example here. Ignatius begins the exercises with what he called the principle and foundation. This is a firm premise that everybody in his 16th century shared, that God has created an orderly, teleological, moving towards a goal, world, with a definite end in sight, planned by God, and established the means in which to get there, principally the church. This structure is one of the solid underpinnings of the whole program of the exercises. The first principle and foundation keeps popping up all along this whole series of exercises. But many seekers possess no such basic principle and no foundation at all. This is precisely what makes them seekers, because they don't have any guiding principles and they don't have a foundation on which they can build their lives. That's why they're seekers. So I've entitled this meditation to make it a quest, looking for principles and a foundation. And so too with the other exercises. They're written for 16th century where things are taken for granted. We live in the 21st. It's a completely different ball game, secular world, et cetera, et cetera. Let me conclude these remarks. Let me sum up the simple logic that holds this proposal that I'm making in this book in 3 points. The first has to do with the problem that faces us. This is the problem to which seekers bear witness, and especially the number of seekers bears witness. We live in a world of intercommunication and interdependence. This world presents a culturally secular face, a neutral world shared in common across religious boundaries and nations and peoples and races, in which many different religions flourish on the premise of religious freedom. Part of the decline of Christianity in the West can be associated with the loss of an exclusivist and supremacist self-identity, which we can no longer maintain in our world today, not pragmatically and not theologically. Many of the doctrines and much of the language on those premises need to be reinterpreted or reconstructed. The question is how to do it. How do you do it? How do we make our Christian faith understandable to our culture today? In response to this, one can imagine the Christian vision being constructed by 2 stories. The first story is the story of Jesus. It has 4 versions in the collected vignettes about Jesus' ministry in the 4 Gospels. This is the small story. the little story of Jesus, and it's the basic story. It's the inner core of Christianity. It is surrounded by a big story, a meta story, that interprets the small story and situates the small story in cosmic terms. This story begins anthropomorphically with God and creation. It includes a fall and the sending of a Redeemer. And it goes forward with the story of the church, leading to the end of time. This meta-story relates to this big story relates to the little story of Jesus, not by a necessary logic, not by deduction, but by reflective existential interpretation over the years, over the centuries. The community reflected on its spiritual life of following Jesus intensely during the period of the writing of the New Testament and afterwards, and developed over centuries the big story that embraced and encompassed the little story within itself. The meta-narrative, the big story told in Christian doctrine, became the introduction to Christianity. Look at any catechism. It's the introduction to the Christian story, and it provided the lens with which people then understood Jesus, frequently without going back to the stories about him. Virtually all the elements of this meta-narrative, this big story, have come under attack in our 20th, 21st century. Creation, fall, redemption, church, end time, all those doctrines are disputed. All of them in theology are debated. Even the possibility of a meta-narrative in our Western culture remains problematic, questionable. Whether or not these assaults on the Christian story, the big story, succeed, the Christian meta-narrative has to be reinterpreted. According to the formula that I'm proposing here, we should not go first to the meta-narrative, to the big story, to interpret Jesus, but should return to the story of Jesus and reinterpret the meta-narrative, the big story, on the basis of the spirituality of following Jesus. Following Jesus and where that leads in our contemporary life will give us the language to begin to reinterpret the big story. This replicates the process which created the meta-narrative in the first place. First, such a proposal addresses both secularity and religious pluralism. It offers both a formula for each individual Christian to reappropriate his or her faith and an outline for a strategy for constructing the discipline of Christianity, reconstructing the discipline of theology in our Western culture. For all seekers, both those outside and those inside the circle of Christian faith, Jesus appears in history as a human being. He is approachable by all. He's friendly. He's attractive to the religious imagination, with a message of ultimate justice and hope. This is not the end of the human quest. I say this again so that no one will misunderstand me here. This is the beginning, not the end. It's rather the place where one has to begin this reconstruction. Jesus will, in fact, be found to teach many of the things taught by other religions and by secular wisdom as well. This helps mutual understanding in a religiously divided world. It doesn't hinder it. As for individual seekers, Jesus will open up for them a personal, loving God who both loves human beings and, out of love, calls them into question. For insiders associating more closely with Jesus again for the first time, as Marcus Borg says, can revitalize one's faith. Jesus enables a person to cut through the big story with a more immediate personal relationship with God. This is both comforting in our new world and also challenging, because Jesus proposes a spirituality of active social concern. At the end of the day, it appears that, in fact, this going back to Jesus of Nazareth describes what most thinking Christians are actually doing. Thank you. Now I'm here, I'm good for questions, and there's 2 mics here, so please come and approach the mic, or if you raise your hand, I'll acknowledge you and you can come up to the mic. But you want to speak into the mic so everybody can hear the question.
I'm curious to know, following the first, second, or third group that you had for the exercises, I'm assuming that you did an evaluation, asked for feedback. So I would like to know what those students said, what was their experience, especially the non-Christian.
Yes. Can you hear me? Oh, I got to turn it on. You won't hear me. How's this? Is that working? No. How's that? Hey, okay. Yeah, so the question is, what were the reactions of some of the people, especially non-believers? At the end of this, it's a course. It was a practicum, a course. I asked them to write 1,000 words on what they thought the genius of the exercises was. You know, that which is really grabbed them as the essential thing that they found in this whole course, in this moving through 8 weeks of daily meditation. What was most... Put this up front. Let me get it here. Who says we theologians aren't practical? There we go.
Let me try to offer you some assistance.
I got it. No, they should hear me struggling with it. I'm a secret too. So no 2 alike. Everyone had a different answer to that question. No 2 alike. It was an objective question. What's the essential thing in these exercises that make them work? Well, really, they're going to write about what turned them on. So I posed an objective question, but I was really culling their subjective response. And you get things like, I never knew God was so available. I never knew God was so so close. You know, you don't have to be at church to find God. You don't have to be reading a prayer to find God. God is close. So things like that. So it really depended where people were coming from. People with a Buddhist meditation background noticed the difference between Ignatian meditation, which is very activist and programmatically for gearing one on to be activist, where Buddhist meditation tends to be getting into oneself and becoming conscious and mindful of oneself, and just sort of being in touch with oneself, so that, whereas Ignatius wants you to be in touch with God so you can be working in the world. He's very action-oriented, so it's a different kind of, but both of them are using meditation, and both Buddhist meditation and Ignatian meditation want a kind of setup that's the same, of quiet, entering into oneself, reserving time, being intentional, being quiet, and entering into a space where one can be in contact with ultimate reality. But so the answer to the question is there was no single answer, many answers.
During your lecture, you used the word evangelical, and that's one reason why I'm here. I'm wondering, in light of the new evangelization in the Catholic circles, how would you use this as an evangelical tool, that is to find the seekers and identify the seekers and introduce them to Jesus? I guess that's my question.
Yeah, but I lost the question. I had an answer to it until you said find the seekers. I don't know how I would do that. But I have, in September, I was asked to do an adult class with a Lutheran parish in Brooklyn. And so I had an hour, 3 Sundays in a row, and I basically did Ignatian meditations with them. It was a Lutheran parish, but it was Hispanic and Anglo. And so it wasn't, it was just sort of an ordinary parish. And they were completely unfamiliar with this method of prayer. So I both explained who Ignatius was and what he was up to, and then did a meditation and led them through the meditation. But you see, it was evangelical. And one woman said after this, they said, well, I meet frequently with my friends. We're a group of about 8 or 10, and we meet and we want to pray together. I'm going to use this method. In other words, it's a way of using the scriptures, the New Testament stories, as a basis for entering into prayer. You just follow the Ignatian 5 steps of a meditation or contemplation. And it's a way of, in effect, of Lectio Divina, of using the text of the Gospels as a basis for doing either a personal prayer, because you could do it on the subway, or a group prayer in a group silent thing, with a leader, without a leader. So long as you know the pattern. So each Sunday I explained a little bit more about what was going on, and by the end of it they had a good idea of how to use this as a way of using the Bible, especially the New Testament, it's Jesus-centered, as a way of entering into mental prayer, but through the text. So that seems to me would have a great appeal to evangelicals and Pentecostals. I see no barrier whatsoever from. And what's brilliant about Ignatius is his use of the imagination, because I do stress that a lot, the imagination, and the imagination allows one to be either a fundamentalist. If you want to be a fundamentalist, you can be a fundamentalist. And if you're a rationalist, you can be a rationalist and still appreciate the Gospels through the use of the imagination. In other words, that's why I'm using this. Usually there's not too many rationalist evangelicals. I mean, that's a little bit play on words, but I'm using evangelical to make the point that these things are rooted in the Gospel. They're not rooted in the Ignatian language, I'm saying. That's an accompaniment. That's an accompaniment, that the nature of these things are gospel-centered. Yeah, please, Dan, please.
I'm talking about the dynamics of the exercises themselves. In the first week presupposes a consciousness not just of sin, but of being a forgiven sinner. And in the dynamic you're proposing, what would replace that? Because we haven't grasped the first principle and foundation as it's written. Mm-hmm. But what would lead the dynamics of the exercises that is generated ordinarily in the standard old way of being conscious of having been a sinner and being forgiven for that, and therefore, what will I do now
Yeah.
as a result of that consciousness? How does that work out in the dynamic of the seeker?
Yeah.
That's what I'm asking.
Well, I think there are plenty of passages in the Bible that describe sin. And so all of the reflections that I give are based on texts from the Bible. Some are texts from Ignatius, but most of the texts from the Bible. And there are some very good passages that describe sin. And theologically, I mean, not too many people would deny that there's a lot of evil in the world, a lot of evil perpetrated by human beings. There is a proclivity towards self-defense and aggressiveness over others. I mean, either in groups or personally, in many cases. So sin is a given. It's a given, it seems to me. The theologian Edward Skillebeck doesn't talk about an orderly world. He talks about a damaged world. Our world is a damaged world. It's a world that could be, and anybody with eyes can see how it could be a much better place if things were not, screwed up by human beings. So sin is, I have a meditation on sin, and then I have a meditation on the Prodigal Son, which depicts God as one who accepts a person whether or not they're sinful, as themselves, as the sinner. So the Prodigal Son it's one of the most beautiful stories in the New Testament, and it gets at the very, very heart of a relationship with God who is both personal and loving and forgiving. So rather than the excruciatingly long 5 meditations on sin in the first week that Ignatius proposes, with an excruciating self-examination of individual acts and so on and so on and so on and so on and so on, I back off from that a little bit and look at sin in the world and look at sin in ourselves and see that God is one who accepts us, justifies us, accepts us, even in our sinfulness.
Roger, I'm a seeker, still am, but when I began to seek, I felt the need to seek together with others. And so my question is, the people you deal with, the seekers you deal with, moving from this faith-filled, as you called it, little story to the big story, to what extent do you find that the seekers you deal with need to seek together with others? That is to, well, affiliate with a believing group or so. What do they want to go it on their own, or do they want to join in and sort of make the pilgrimage with others?
Yeah. So that's a good question, and it's a very, very important question for a place where I am now, an interdenominational seminary, where people are there of all stripes. I mean of all stripes. So they practically all share this appellation, seeker. But they're also very guarded about their personal stories, because their personal stories are frequently so personal and so unique that they think, well, no one else is like me. You get a whole class of entering 95, 100 students, and everybody thinks that their story is absolutely unique. It takes them a semester or two to realize that everybody comes thinking that they have an absolutely unique story and no one is like them. But in there lies a lesson that this kind of seeking on the deepest level requires a safe group. You cannot share on this level with just this guy or this woman or that woman. You have to find out your small group. Some are intentional. They form covenant groups. Covenant groups are just what it says. A group, 5 to 10 people, meet weekly, and they'll talk faith talk. And they'll talk about where they are. But you need that, especially in this environment, pluralistic environment, you need that quote-unquote safe space. Safe space is a very pregnant phrase. It refers to a place where I can actually talk about my inner faith commitments and not feel that they're being received with respect and absolute. So when you're in a large pluralistic crowd, you have to create that space. If you're running a seminar, it takes me time to set up, even in a classroom. Like I have a group, discussion group on Christology, and these last couple of weeks have been extraordinary. One's 4 people in it. One is an evangelical, very, very evangelical, naive evangelical faith. Another guy is coming from nowhere, and suddenly he's starting to move towards Christianity. Very, very bright. Other person is a kind of standard denomination, mainline Christian, and another one works for the UN on the side and is a very, very committed student and maybe go on for further studies. Well, they all didn't know each other when they first came in, but now they've been talking with each other for the semester. Now they start sharing on a deep level and asking questions that are very deep and probing about Jesus Christ and so on. They're not all Christians. I mean, the one fellow is moving towards Christianity, but he's not there yet, and so on. So safe space, finding a group, and they all do find groups, small groups or bigger groups, in which they feel that they can begin to ask these questions and not feel isolated in their, isolated in their seeking. Yeah, Tom.
My question is somewhat related to George's. As you alluded to, religious identity is much more fluid these days. Here, I think surveys have shown that around 10% of Americans identify themselves as former Catholics, for example. So in your experience of leading the exercises to these seekers, to what extent were you having to deal with seekers who already had an experience of, for example, the meta-narrative of Christianity, their experience of a church, experiences of woundedness, betrayal, whatever, and not just in the Christian church, but in other forms of religious communities?
Mm-hmm.
How much of their experience was having to let go of a previous experience?
Mm-hmm.
In other words, we could think of seekers as being a tabula rasa, but I would imagine more often than not that was not the case.
Mm-hmm.
So what was your experience of dealing with people's past religious experiences as they were seeking a new one?
Yeah. The answer to that question is not, let's say, answer to that question has 2 parts. In one part of the question is, what happens with the religious baggage that people are bringing to the seminary and are both trying to salvage that and to let it go at the same time and build something new? Well, the school has a lot of role in that play. People who come without biblical criticism realize that the Bible was written in a certain way. It wasn't just whispered by God into an author's ear. So there's a lot of the classes and the critical intellectual milieu of Union Theological Seminary solves some of that problem. It puts baggage where it belongs if it's not useful baggage. So in a way, what I'm doing is part of reconstruction after that baggage has, and people who come to do the exercises are coming there because they are open and want to hear. And so they're more like sponges. They want to hear what they've heard, that these spiritual exercises are kind of classic in the history of Christian spirituality, still a living document, still people. And so they're open to it, and they sort of drink it in. But they kind of leave their intellects behind. In other words, it's a spirituality that's maybe it's building underneath the spirituality, underneath the intellectuality, so that the intellectuality can catch up with their religious affections and so on. The points for meditation, I must admit, they're not pious points. They're analytical points. They're probing questions, because I think seekers are people who are asking questions. So it's not going to the text and finding the Jesus of piety there. It's finding a first century prophet and healer and teacher, and I presuppose biblical criticism and try to recreate Jesus in his milieu. And so that's the basis for their own reconstruction on an intellectual level, and the school is helping in that role too. So I don't see my task in this particular situation as being antithetical, but working hand in glove with destruction and construction, or deconstruction and reconstruction. It's part of an overall process of a 3-year program or 3-year course. I think one last question. I think we can talk some more outside.
Yeah, actually it goes to your point about the guy who doesn't believe but is going towards Christianity. Have you had people who, who have taken your classes and done the exercises and gone to applied them to a different religion, like Judaism or Islam or Buddhism or such, applying them as the non-Christian religion?
Mm-hmm.
Have you had that happen?
Yeah, I haven't had that experience. In other words, people who are coming to these exercises know that they're exercises in Christian spirituality. I've had people who are not Christians come, but I think I'm not aware of anybody who became a Christian because they did the spiritual exercises, nor am I aware of anybody who moved to another religion because of the spiritual exercises. You do have at Union Theological Seminary dual belongers, people who belong to 2 religions at once, and sort of put together in their own way, each one in their own way, membership of two different religions. But by and large, the people who come to do these exercises are looking for Christian spirituality, because that's what's being offered them. So thank you very much.